Hello everyone, dear friends. Tu Diep almost lost his memory when James went to the police house to say goodbye. Why didn't the police tell James that he found a girl in the woods? What's behind this? Why didn't the police tell James that Tu Diep, who had lost her memory, was at his house? The rain fell softly that morning, like whispers of a secret the world wasn't ready to share. James sat by the window of his empty office, the steam from his untouched coffee fading as quickly as his patience. It had been weeks since Tu Diep disappeared without a trace. Every night he searched, every morning he hoped. And every time the phone rang, his heart paused, waiting, praying. But no one ever told him the truth, not even the police. What James didn't know was this: just 2 districts away, in a quiet countryside home surrounded by rice fields and the scent of lemongrass, Tu Diep was alive. She was bruised, feverish, and broken in memory, but she was alive. And she was staying in the house of an off-duty police officer. Why didn't they tell him? It wasn't negligence. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Tu Diep had been found on the side of the road, unconscious and burning with fever. When she woke up, she couldn't even remember her name. The only words she could whisper were, "Don't let him find me." No one knew who he was. No one could be sure what danger she had escaped. So the officer, an old man named Mr. Bao, made a choice to protect her in silence. He didn't know James. He didn't know that he was the one losing sleep every night, calling hospitals, begging for information. He only knew that Tu Diep's hands trembled when she heard the word city, and her eyes filled with tears when someone mentioned James. But memory is a strange thing. It doesn't come back all at once. It returns in flickers, a piano tune in the wind, a certain brand of cologne, the name hockey whispered by a child in the village. And slowly, very slowly, Tu Diep began to remember. She remembered a pair of warm eyes, a voice that always called her name gently. A man who promised to protect her but whose face remained lost in the mist of her broken mind. She knew she had to leave. She couldn't explain why. Just that something was missing, something she needed to find before it was too late. So one morning, while Mr. Bao was out buying medicine, she left. No note, no goodbye. Only a silent prayer that the man in her memories would find her, somehow. And back in the city, when James finally received a call from a local vendor who thought he saw a girl who looked like the one on your posters, he dropped everything and ran. Because love doesn't stop for fear, and fate doesn't wait for permission. The sun was beginning to set when James reached the small village market where someone had claimed to see her. His heart raced, his shirt clung to his back with sweat. Every step he took stirred up dust from the road and 1,000 thoughts in his mind. What if it's not her? What if it's too late? What if she remembers nothing? He stopped in front of a quiet little shop with faded signs and the smell of fresh noodles. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled by the man's urgency. "Excuse me, I'm looking for a young woman. She's about this tall, long hair, kind face. Her name is Tu Diep." His voice cracked. "Someone said she was here." The woman squinted, then slowly nodded. "She was here this morning, bought a bread roll, asked about directions to the temple on the hill." James turned, eyes following the dusty path toward the mountain's edge. A temple, quiet, peaceful, a place for lost souls to pray. Without another word, he ran. Tu Diep sat on the temple steps, watching the orange sky melt into the horizon. Her hands gripped a small fabric pouch, something she had found in her borrowed coat pocket. It had a name stitched on it. James. She didn't know who he was, but the name gave her comfort. It made her heart ache for something she couldn't explain. Was he someone she loved? Someone she lost? Someone who hurt her? The questions spun like wind chimes in her mind, each one ringing louder than the last. She closed her eyes, and then, Tu Diep. Her eyes flew open. That voice, that voice. She turned slowly. There he was, standing a few steps below, breathless, dirt on his pants. A wild look in his eyes, but it was him. The man from her dreams, the echo in her memory. The heartbeat she couldn't name, James? She whispered, almost afraid to believe it. He stepped forward, as if scared she would disappear again. Tu Diep, it's me. I've been looking for you everywhere. Are you okay? You don't remember me? She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I don't know. I don't know anything. But this, she held up the pouch, this name, it made me feel safe. He swallowed hard, stepping closer, now just inches away. I've missed you, he said. You once told me, if you ever got lost, I should follow your heart to find you. I did, and I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She looked into his eyes, and suddenly something shifted. Not a full memory, just a sensation. Warmth. Safety. Home. Then maybe, she whispered, you can help me remember. And as the first stars blinked in the sky above them, James gently took her hand. Yes, he said, we'll find our way back, together. That night, the sky was clear, filled with stars that shimmered like secrets waiting to be told. James led Tu Diep down the mountain path, his hand gently supporting her as she walked. There was silence between them, not empty, but full. She still couldn't recall the memories, but being beside him felt right. At a quiet guest house near the village edge, James helped her settle into a room. He brought her warm porridge, a blanket, and a glass of water. I can sleep out here in the hallway, he offered gently. You'll be safe. She nodded slowly, looking at him with soft, uncertain eyes. James, do you think my memory will ever return? He gave her a faint smile, though there was sadness behind it. I don't know. But even if it doesn't, I'll remind you every day of who you are, of who we are. Tu Diep's fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her blanket. The name James still stirred something in her. Not quite a memory, more like a distant melody she used to hum. That night, she dreamed ... a forest, a hand reaching for hers. Laughter, a field of sunflowers, a promise whispered, no matter what happens, I'll find you. She awoke with tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, miles away, in a shadowed office filled with smoke and secrets, John slammed a glass against the wall. She's alive, he roared. The man across from him flinched. Yes, sir. A villager said he saw her near the old temple. John's eyes narrowed, and James, he found her. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. John stood slowly, the chair creaking under his weight. I gave them a chance to disappear, but if she remembers, if she talks. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Bring her back, John hissed. Before she remembers everything. Back in the village, Tu Diep and James walked along a quiet riverbank. She was beginning to feel stronger. Her voice had more warmth, her smile less hesitation. But in the distance, behind the trees, someone was watching, waiting, and time was running out. The next morning dawned with golden light spilling across the mountain village. Birds chirped from the rooftops as if nothing in the world was broken. But inside Tu Diep's heart, something was stirring, uneasy, raw, and insistent. She sat by the window, staring at the mist curling over the distant hills. James entered quietly with 2 cups of tea. You didn't sleep much, he said softly. Tu Diep didn't respond right away. She looked at him, really looked, and then asked, James, have we been in love? The question struck him like a wave. Yes, he whispered, setting the tea down. We are. She pressed a hand to her temple. Why do I feel like I've betrayed you? James reached for her hand. You haven't. You were taken. You were hurt. None of this was your fault. But in her chest, guilt pressed like a weight she couldn't explain. That evening, she wandered alone to the edge of the village where an old swing hung from a tree. Children used to play there, now it was quiet. As she touched the rope, a sharp pain shot through her head. Suddenly, flashes came back, blurred faces, a scream. A man shouting, a gun, a hand pulling her away. The swing, blood, she stumbled back, gasping. James caught her just in time. I remember the swing, she whispered. I was running. Someone was chasing me. James held her tightly. It's okay. It's coming back slowly. You're safe now. But in the shadows nearby, a pair of eyes watched. The man sent by John had found them. He waited until nightfall. That night, a sudden knock on their door shattered the silence. James stood up, cautious. Stay behind me, he whispered. He opened the door. It wasn't just one man, it was two. One stepped forward with a friendly smile. Sorry to bother you so late. We're looking for a girl who went missing. Villagers said they saw someone matching her description. Tu Diep stepped into view instinctively and the man's smile vanished. That's her. James moved in front of her. She's not going anywhere with you. The second man drew a weapon. We were told to bring her back quietly or not. Tu Diep froze, but then bang, a flash. A third figure emerged from behind the trees, a police officer. Drop it, he shouted. The weapon clattered to the ground. The two men were arrested quickly, taken away into the night. James turned to the officer, stunned. Why are you here? The officer looked regretful. I should have told you earlier. When we found Tu Diep that day, she didn't remember anything. She panicked and ran before we confirmed her identity. I didn't know she'd end up here with you. I only realized the connection when we traced John's network. James stared at him, disbelief and gratitude mixing in his eyes. So John really was behind this, the officer nodded. And now, with Tu Diep's memory coming back, we have a chance to take him down for good. James looked at Tu Diep. She was trembling, but standing strong. I remember the swing, she whispered again. And I remember you. Tears filled James's eyes. Then we fight, he said, together. Life lesson from Tu Diep's journey. Sometimes, the heart remembers what the mind forgets. Even in the darkest moments when memories fade, and the past feels lost, love has a way of guiding us home. Tu Diep's story teaches us that no matter how broken we feel, healing is possible when we are surrounded by care, patience, and truth. We also learn that running away from fear is human, but facing it is brave. When Tu Diep ran, it wasn't because she was weak, it was because her soul was fighting to protect something fragile inside. And when she stood up again, remembered who she was, and chose to trust James, she showed what true strength looks like. Finally, the story reminds us that we must listen to our instincts, whether it's to stay, to fight, or to forgive. And above all, that the people who truly love us will always search for us, even when we're lost. Continued life lesson from Tu Diep's journey. Another powerful message in Tu Diep's journey is about trust, how easily it can be broken, and how slowly it must be rebuilt. When someone loses their memory, they don't just forget people, they lose their sense of safety. But James's unwavering search for Tu Diep shows us that loyalty doesn't end when things get hard. True love waits, heals, and protects without expecting anything in return. We also learn that not everyone who offers help has pure intentions. Tu Diep's near encounter with danger while trying to escape reminds us to stay alert and cautious, especially in moments of weakness. Life can test us when we are most vulnerable, but it also sends quiet signs of hope if we know where to look. And finally, we realize that fate sometimes works in silence. The police never told James, and yet the paths of destiny were quietly weaving them back together. It teaches us that even when we don't see the full picture, something greater may be at work behind the scenes. So hold on, trust the process, and believe that what is meant for you will find its way, just as Tu Diep found her way back to herself and back to love.